Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we start our business with the submission of Avon Otakaro Network. Who is going to speak on their behalf?
Commissioner Shepherd, it's Tavisha here. We don't have a representative from Avon Otakaro Network here.
You think that they might be coming, or shall we get on with the next submitter?
I've had no correspondence from them.
Well, next on the list is Carleton Dairies. Is there anyone here from Carleton Dairies?
Yes, we have Tim Wells here.
Thank you.
I've just got that PowerPoint, if that's possible. Okay, that's good. Yep, thank you. Yeah, thank you, David. Good afternoon. Looks like you're enjoying a good Melbourne coffee over there before you after your lunch. So that's good. And
Welcome to you, and thank you very much for coming in. We have your submission and we have your evidence statement, and we've read both of those, so you don't need to read them out to us, but I'm sure that there are things that you'll want to explain to us, and we will have a few questions to ask of you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just give you a brief introduction. So, yeah, my family business is obviously out at Oxford. My brother manages the dairy farm. My parents live on the dairy farm. All of my siblings are involved in the running of the family business. My career is in financial services, where I work for ANZ as a relationship manager, looking after agri customers in Canterbury, and then I also sit on the board of Waimakere Irrigation, and have had various experience in the financial services industry over my career. We'll just start with a little bit of the sort of family history. My family, when I was in the UK, I did a bit of research into the family history, and they immigrated from Kent in the late 1800s via Adelaide and settled on a farm at View Hill. It was a relatively large family, I think of about 10 children, and then they've kind of dispersed all around Canterbury. My relatives still own the original family farm at View Hill, just sort of southwest of Oxford, and then the family expanded their land holdings in 1950 when my grandfather purchased the property where my parents currently reside, which is 6 k's southeast of Oxford. The property's on the boundary of the Eyre River, and has always had quite a high water table with aquifers that are hydraulically linked to flows in the Eyre River and my grandfather attempted to hand dig an irrigation well in the 1960s, found water from a spring, and wasn't able to get sufficient yield at the depth he dug, so then he employed a well driller to get water sort of 10 to 20 metres. The well is still in use today. It's a bit of a backup for us, and we started irrigating from groundwater in 1965. The water back in those days, they just pumped it out of the ground and down a stock water race, and then pumped it out via a diesel pump onto aluminium pipes in the paddocks and shifted them by hand. These early spray irrigation systems were very labour intensive. The farming operation was traditionally a sort of traditional Canterbury mixed farming operation with sheep cropping, milked a few cows through a 3-bay sort of walk-through shed, and they bred and trained harness racing horses. The business grew over time and was then eventually split between 3 brothers. Each brother was sort of given a start in farming with about 150 hectare farm, which today's terms is not probably really an economic scale unit, but working together where they shared labour and plant, and with my mum or my aunties worked off farm as well. They were able to make a sufficient living with the start they got in farming, and were able to grow their business from there. The irrigation systems evolved over time from the hand-shifted pipes to a side roll to rotor rainers and to now centre pivot and efficient centre pivot irrigation. The Waimakere irrigation scheme was commissioned in 1999, and because our family already was well experienced in the benefits of irrigation, we joined the scheme. That carried on. Not a lot probably changed in terms of our farming systems. Once the scheme came through, we continued sheep and cropping farming, but this was not really economic. Sheep farming under irrigation was not really economic to carry on that model, so something had to change in terms of the farm system to make it economic and facilitate succession. So that resulted in one of my uncles sold his farm and moved to Southland and set up his 2 sons on some more economic scale sheep and beef units, and we made the decision to convert to dairy farming, and that has enabled our business to grow, acquire adjoining family land and a neighbouring property that's come up as well, and then we still lease some land that's owned by my other uncle who's still in the district. Our property. I mean, the Waimakere irrigation scheme has resulted in a lot of land use and ownership change in the district, and our property is now surrounded by dairy farms, and if we'd not converted to dairy, it would have been likely eventually our business would have either been sold to a dairy farm, or we would have had to evolve into a more intensive operation, whether that's intensive cropping or dairy grazing or lamb trading. But I think the decision to go to dairy farming has been really beneficial in terms of getting, in terms of a profitable farming business, being able to grow a business, and then being able to involve all my siblings in the running of the business. It really is genuinely a family business. My father still works on the farm where he can. He's got Parkinson's disease. It's slowed him down quite a bit, but he was still driving the tractor at sort of 70 years age a couple of years ago. Yes, that's a little bit about my family history.
Thank you for that.
Just wanted to touch a little bit on the history of Oxford as well. I've got some information here. There's a book, Oxford, the First 100 Years. I mean, really the history of the Oxford district has been of, it was originally a timber industry, a deforestation of the beech forests, and then drainage of swamps for agriculture, and then we've seen agriculture develop, and then Waimaka irrigation scheme came in 1999, and then we've also seen a lot of lifestyle development as well, lifestyle blocks within the commuter belt of Christchurch. And yeah, I guess where we're at today, the farmers of today sort of feels like we're being blamed for water quality problems that have been caused by hundreds of years of development in the district. And then we've got planners and groundwater scientists have come up with this model and then a map in the nitrate priority areas and drawn some lines on a map, and then it's really potentially the nitrate priority area is going to put farmers out of business, particularly in the purple zone, where there's those long stage reductions through to 2080. And it's really created a massive cloud over the future of farming in the district. And I'll touch on that a little bit later about some of the financial vulnerability of farmers and the impact on land values and that sort of things. Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, touching on that, is the drainage of the swamps and man-made influence on the natural water resources. So you've got like the likes of the Cust River. You know, in terms of, we've got some history here about that, where the drainage of the Rangiora Swamp, 7,000 acre Rangiora Swamp, a drainage scheme accidentally incorporated the Cust River back in the 1860s. That's why we have the Cust main drain today that flows into the Kaipoi, the Kaipoi River. So it's really, some of this legacy stuff needs to be impacted or considered when looking at changes for the future. And I'll just, if I could bring the PowerPoint up. The first point I just want to make about the nitrate priority area, and you've got this kind of little triangle area just up near Oxford that's not currently part of the nitrate priority area. And this is basically was swampland that has been drained for agriculture, and there's a drainage scheme that the Waimakariri District Council was responsible for, and then a lot of those drains flow into the Eyre River, which is then part of, which is boundary where we farm, and basically that water will be leaching under the ground and contributing to water quality problems into the nitrate priority area. So I really don't understand how this little area is not included, and I strongly disagree that we have the nitrate priority area. I think it should be a scheme-wide and a district-wide approach. All farmers are in this together. Let's not divide the district via lines. Let's just have a pragmatic solution that's achievable over the sort of medium term, not let's go out 80 odd years. So I'll just show you a bit more about this example. But this is the map of the drains in the Oxford district, and so it's actually part of an urban drain system for the Oxford community as well. And these drains of sort of swampland around Oxford ultimately end up in the Cust River, or they end up in the Eyre River via the Bennett's diversion. It doesn't quite show that on the map, but there is a stream that flows all the way into the Eyre River. And this is basically that area which is not included in the nitrate priority area, and effectively the runoff is flowing into water bodies that are in the nitrate priority area. So I just wanted to highlight that as an example of what I see as poor planning and poor considerations of the actual natural geography. And there's a lot of local knowledge among farmers, and we know our local catchments, our local districts, and we've supposedly been consulted on this whole plan, and it kind of just doesn't feel that way when we sort of see examples like this that are just not logical, I suppose. This next slide I just wanted to talk about this is the number of septic tanks in the Waimakariri district, and there's 7,500 septic tanks. If you say three people per household, that's 21,000 people whose sewerage is going into the groundwater effectively, and we don't know how well some of these septic tanks are working. So there's been some analysis from ECAN saying that it's only equivalent to a dairy farm of 2,000 hectares. I'd sort of struggle to believe that. I think it would be worse than that. There just needs to be some consideration as to are septic tanks causing some of the nitrate and water quality problems in the district, and a lot of the blame's been pushed onto dairy farmers and intensive irrigation, and we've got to make all these reductions, but what about the human effluent in the area? We've seen massive lifestyle development. I went to boarding school in the mid-90s, and then I commuted for a couple of years in the sort of mid-90s, and I have first-hand experienced the change in the district from commuting times to amount of traffic, the school rolls. It's been massive, and it's even post-earthquake, the lifestyle influence and the population in the Waimak is increasing. So I think there's got to be consideration about, are septic tanks working? Are they impacting water quality? And the next sort of point I'll just move on to this one here. So there's a report from ECAN back in 2016 that was approved by the chief scientist in 2018. This is the current state of groundwater quality in the Waimakariri zone, and it actually paints a pretty good picture. Some comments in here. On average, groundwater nitrate concentrations have been relatively steady in the Waimakariri zone for the past 3 decades. We've also got the point that there are some long periods where nitrate concentrations appeared to be decreasing, 1999 to 2005, after the Waimakariri irrigation scheme came online, and other times where concentrations have been increasing. Average groundwater nitrate concentrations for these 2 subzones have not been as high under WRRP irrigation as they were in the early 1990s before the scheme began. So I just see this research from ECAN, which is fairly recent, and then we had the zone committee recommendations, the modelling, and Plan Change 7, and it's sort of contradicting actually some of the research that we've seen about water quality in the district recently. So I think one of the key things that I'm concerned about is the lack of monitoring, and there's probably about a dozen wells that have been monitored amongst ECAN and Waimakariri district wells, and there's not enough data, and there's not enough historical data. We've seen Silverstream, there's only data going back to 2006. That's one of the key issues, is the nitrate levels in Silverstream. What has that been caused by? Do we know what it was historically? Is nitrates naturally occurring? Is it been impacted by some of the man-made influence, like the Eyre River is diverted. There's a diversion on the Eyre River where it naturally used to possibly flow out through Silverstream. Is the lifestyle influence causing some of the nitrate issues at Silverstream? So these are some of the questions that are unanswered. This is the monitoring of our own well since we've done the dairy conversion, and the nitrate levels in one of our shallowest wells on our property since dairy conversion, and that's showing no adverse trends, or you could argue a declining trend. Yeah, I mean, so that sort of just talks to one of the main points in my submission. There is limited evidence from hard data to support the thesis that the nitrate problem is being caused by intensive agriculture, and there needs to be more research and more monitoring and less reliance on overseer modelling and an uncertain groundwater model. Yeah, in my submission, there's quite a lot of research from registered valuation firms, Reserve Bank data, and that's and Dairy NZ info about the level of debt in the dairy industry, and I mean we've clearly seen the result of Plan Change 7 has created a lot of uncertainty about the future of farming in the Waimak district, and that has absolutely had an influence on land values in the district already. And farmers really need to maintain a strong balance sheet so they can continue to invest in infrastructure improvements, and make the necessary technological investment to achieve the proposed reductions. So yeah, it's a really is a balancing act, because we all understand we need to try and make reductions. We're all on board with, a lot of us are doing really good things around repairing planting and irrigation efficiency, soil moisture monitoring. Water storage is another thing, water reliability. So we need to do all these things, but we need to have viable farm businesses in the future to be able to do that. And so that's why we need, just some pretty good certainty for the next 10 years, so we can all adapt, make changes, and achieve, the first stage of reductions. But we need to have a long-term future of farming in the district. I don't need to go into it really, but I'll just take it as read that there clearly has already been a major impact on land values from the proposals. And that sort of has also impacting, farmer well-being, the livelihoods of, of people in the district, and mental health of farmers. I mean, this is something over the last 18 months to 2 years, the community is really concerned about these proposals, and they just want to, I think there's a feeling we just want to get something that's pragmatic, achievable, and we need to move on and move ahead with our business and our industry. But I think the problem is the nitrate priority area and the lack of consultation, and the way it's been managed. I think there's a feeling in the community of, this is just more bureaucracy, more environmental compliance burdens, and people are worried about their futures and their livelihoods. In terms of outcomes and things, I mean, from my point of view, I think farmers just want to focus on practical solutions, and they're best managed through the farm environment plan process, which most farmers or irrigated farmers already well advanced in that process and have those plans in place, and localised catchment management. I mean, there's examples of some projects that we're trying to get off the ground to improve riparian planting streams, or there's a project we're looking at in that drain area that drains into the Eyre River, of improving a stream or water body that's choked by willows, and fixing that, and farmers getting on board, neighbouring landowners, and actually trying to do some on-the-ground actions that make a difference. So we're really focused on that, and that is something that I'd like ECAN to help facilitate, and the local zone committees and getting some funding and resources to help us achieve those things, because that's what farmers are good at, is getting their hands dirty and making a difference. So if we're able to do that kind of stuff, identify appropriate projects around the district, we'll be able to fix some of the problems that we can see based on our local knowledge and our practical skills. The last point is just around the winter grazing thresholds that have been proposed in Plan Change 7. I think these need to be aligned with the National Environmental Standards Freshwater Regulations 2020 that's come out from the government, because in the plan change at the moment, I think the proposed thresholds are 5 hectares for any property less than 100, and 5% of the area for any property over 100 hectares. So I think it would make sense that they are aligned with the government regulations, and we're not, for consistency and fairness reasons. I mean, winter grazing, we're probably all going to have to go and get resource consents for that as well. It's just another compliance burden, another cost that's being forced onto farmers. And my other point is, there's a proposed common expiry date of 2037. I don't think ECAN or the consultancy industry probably have the resources to manage a bottleneck of all consents expiring at the same time. I think that should be staggered and should be just a standard sort of up to 15-year resource consent duration. I guess if there's a bottleneck based on the laws of supply and demand, it's just going to increase cost for farmers again, because consultants are going to be snowed under, and it'll increase costs for farmers. So that's kind of everything I wanted to bring to your attention anyway. So appreciate any questions.
Well, thank you for your summary, and we read it in conjunction with the original submission and the written evidence statement that you provided us with, and thank you for doing that. Let's see if there's questions for you from the bench. Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Mr. Wells?
Yes, I do have a couple of questions. Thank you for your submission, Mr. Wells. It was really interesting and refreshing to hear about your whānau connections and how your farm's being run as a family business, and with lots of your siblings and uncles and aunties involved. When you talked about the history of Oxford and you said it began with forestry, I don't think it did begin with forestry. There was people in the community before forestry, and I'm talking about Ngāi Tahu history.
Sure.
And then you also mentioned about 100, when you were talking about the nutrient loadings in the waterways, you mentioned that farming gets blamed for that, and then you said previously, it took hundreds of years previous, there was development. What were you referring to?
Well, it's farming development, I suppose. So drainage of swamps for farming. So we've seen
That's what you were talking about.
the forestry industry. There was a lot of timber mills in Oxford, and then some fires I think took out a lot of the remaining forestry, and then the development until the irrigation scheme came through was pretty much dry land sheep farming. We had some major fires in the 80s around Airwall Forest, some really serious ones, and some very serious droughts, which resulted in the farmers in the community getting the irrigation scheme off the ground. So it was a pretty tough way to make a living, I'd say, dry land sheep farming on a lot of the land around Oxford.
In hindsight, because we've learnt the value of wetlands and swamps and bogs and those sorts of places, maybe removing all the wetlands, the Rangiora wetlands that you're talking about, maybe that might have contributed to nutrient loadings in waterways, do you think?
Well, potentially, if you look at this slide, is the drainage system around Rangiora. So that's basically how the Rangiora swamp has been drained, and then that flows all into mostly flows into the Kaipoi River, I think. I don't know the area that well, but it all sort of flows into the Cuss main drain and then into the Kaipoi River, or the Cam River. I totally agree. I think this drainage of swamps is contributing to the water quality problems, and maybe that's what's contributing to Silverstream as well, because Silverstream seems to be the hot spot, but it sort of feels like it's all being blamed on dairy farmers for causing the Silverstream nitrate issue, but I haven't seen enough evidence to suggest that it's all dairy farming. Yeah.
When you talked about the septic tanks and things like that, and I think the reality is that we all contribute, and it shouldn't be all put at the feet of farmers, but you have to admit the agricultural industry does contribute much of it.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. Yep. And there's things we can do to improve our environmental footprint. I mean, I think, our family business, we run a pretty good business. We're Lead with Pride certified with Synlait. We're an A Farm Environment Plan audit or equivalent. We've made some pretty good end loss reductions below baseline already. So we're, I think, in terms of our family business, we're punching above our weight in terms of the environmental footprint. But it's probably trying to get everyone up to that kind of level, or raising the bar is quite difficult because of financial considerations, management ability, having a balance sheet so you can fund your investment.
That's all the questions I have for you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Commissioner Van Dorthuizen.
Yeah, thank you very much. No questions for you. The evidence was clear, but just to, in terms of the issue you raised about intensive winter grazing, when we're aware that there are the new national regulations now, and they do have different thresholds than the regional plan. The national regulations also introduce a slope criteria, so the 10-degree slope criteria for winter grazing, so that's something the plan doesn't do. So it is a pretty complicated regime now for people in the field to understand. So we're certainly aware of that, and that's something we'll be turning our minds to as we proceed through the hearing, not only on that issue, but a number of issues. So,
sure. Thank you.
It's got a lot more complicated now, though.
Yeah,
I appreciate that and certainly understand the concern. No more questions from me.
Mr. Wells, sorry.
Sorry, David, I was just saying no more questions from me because you can't see us.
Okay. We should get that fixed. Mr. Wells, it's particularly valuable for us to hear from you today because you have that admirable combination of being a professional banker yourself as well as being involved in the family farming business. And so that helps us. So when the family business decided 20 years ago now, I think, you said, to join in with the WIMAC irrigation scheme, would they have considered, would you and your fellow members of the family had considered anything like nitrate effects and so forth, or would that not have been in the areas you'd have considered as early as that?
When we joined the irrigation scheme, so the decision was probably made about 1997. The scheme was built or commissioned in 99. Yeah, look, I don't think nitrates would have been a consideration back then. Yeah, I recall doing some a high school project on the building of the scheme and for my geography class, and yeah, it certainly wasn't an environmental consideration that was front of mind back then. However, when we converted to dairy in the mid-2000s, it was something that had been raised on one of our, even was a condition on one of our water consents that we start testing the groundwater for nitrates. That's how come we've got the data actually that I was able to put up in that slide. So yeah, 10 years later, it certainly had become a consideration.
And at that time, you'd also have been aware that there were national policies about to be finalised about all of this. This NPS that we've now got is about the third or fourth version of it, and it was in public knowledge at the time, 2008. So as a business proposition, making that conversion, and that was a pretty major business proposition for the family, would you have done some due diligence about the effects of making that change that would have allowed for the possibility of regulation in respect of nitrates and other things?
No, I don't think we saw this coming at that time. It's evolved pretty quickly, this space. I mean, we only started having to put flow meters on our irrigation takes about 10 years ago. So previously we could just take water and it wasn't even metered. So this space has evolved very quickly. I mean, we've always, we're a family business and we've owned this land, for 70 odd years. So we see ourselves as good custodians of the land. We don't want to ruin it for future generations. We want to keep improving it, leave it in a better state than we found it. And we're also, we're also conscious of water quality. We live on the boundary of the Eyre River, even though the river flows is dry for long periods over summer. But we enjoy going down to the river with our kids and playing in the pools. And I mean, personally, I competed in multi-sport. I'm into kayaking. I'm into triathlon. I swim in waterways. I've got a personal interest in making sure that waterways are healthy, and I don't want to be swimming in dirty water. But yeah, I mean, I guess to answer your question, when you go through a dairy conversion, you've got to make sure your resource consents are nailed down. So that was our groundwater consents to make sure we had enough water along with our WIMAC water to irrigate, and then an effluent consent so we can spread effluent around the farm. And that is a fairly comprehensive process you got to go through in terms of assessment of environmental effects. So, I mean, there was certainly things that we were thinking about when we converted, but we were just nailing down the consents. I guess what has happened actually with the rule changes and the nutrients, it has actually, when everyone worked out the rules were coming in, it sped up the development. So there was more dairy conversions and more intensification, so people could go ahead and get it done to beat the rules and get their baselines in place. So it was a sort of unintended consequences of the rule changes. It sped up farm development.
Bit of a gold rush, was it?
Yeah, it was, 100%.
Yes. When you were speaking to us a few minutes ago, you referred to the nitrate area, and you said you disagreed with that and you felt that it should be district-wide. I'm not quite sure that I understand how that would work. Have you thought that through a bit further?
Well, just between the Waimak and the Ashley, make it all the same. That would be my opinion.
Do you think that the farmers who are in parts of that area that have got no great contribution at all to the nitrates would welcome being included in this area?
Oh, they of course they wouldn't, but it's going to have less impact. What has been proposed here, especially for these guys in the purple zone, it's just created a massive cloud over their future, and this is what the registered valuation firms refer to as well. That's like that they might not be able to continue dairy farming in that purple zone, or they'll have to decommission their sheds and grow crops, or change land use, or sell up, or. But if you go for a whole district-wide approach at more manageable levels, it's not going to create these sort of isolated issues for certain farmers that are basically being put out of business. So it's better to be.
It's a reputation issue, are you?
Sorry,
a reputation issue.
Well, if your farm is in that purple zone and you've got to make staged reductions to 2080, and you're an investor or you're looking at buying a dairy farm, you're not going to go and buy a dairy farm in that zone, are you? So it's going to impact your land value. And yeah, and I think it's fairly consistent with Will's submission as well, that we want to do it on a scheme-wide basis as more manageable. But yeah, I sort of probably don't agree that all that swampland around Rangiora, there's lots of dairy farms that they're not contributing to some of the water quality problems as well. So why don't they have to make some of the, stage reductions, for the first 10 years at least, and then we monitor, and then everyone's in the same boat for the first 10 years. We do more monitoring, we do more science, we understand it better, and then, rather than this real long-term approach and the granular subzones and I really don't understand how you can just go and draw lines on a map like that and say these guys are worse than these guys. It's the neighbour versus neighbour thing, or people have farm operations in various different zones as well. It's really confusing. It's my strong feeling is that we're all in this together, and that's not going and it's it's not going to create the winners and losers sort of situation, which is really divisive.
You also referred to the septic tanks, and you told us that there's 7,500 septic tanks in this catchment and 21,000 people, and you rejected the idea that would only be contributing the equivalent of 2,000 hectares of dairying. What do you propose should be done about that contribution? Well, sorry about the word, but you know what I mean.
Oh, there probably just needs to be more education, I suppose, to landowners to make sure their septic tanks are working properly. Yeah, a lot of septic tanks, new septic tanks these days have to have resource consents, but a lot of legacy septic tanks don't have consents. So, yeah, it's probably quite a hard thing to regulate, but it's probably just an acknowledgement that it's having an impact on water quality. You know, it's quite a large town of people whose sewage is going into the groundwater, and you know, I've done some a little bit of online research into internationally. I think people recognise that it is a concern of nitrate. It can cause high nitrates, poorly performing septic tanks. So I think it's something that needs to be acknowledged, and probably education that everybody's got to do their bit. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Wells, thank you very much for answering the questions and for bringing your understanding of all these issues in that very admirable combination of yours, the skills and knowledge. We're very grateful to you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks very much, David.
Now we're ready for the submission of Dairy New Zealand. Who is going to speak on their behalf?
One moment, Commissioner Shepherd. They're just stepping up to the table now.
Yeah. Now, we very much welcome the speakers on behalf of Dairy New Zealand. That's another important and valuable part of the information that we need to have. And who will be the person who speaks first?
Kia ora koutou, that'll be myself, Charlotte Wright, Senior Policy Advisor at Dairy NZ.
Yes.
And I'll introduce the rest of the team.
If you would, please.
So I'm joined by Dr. Graham Dool, Principal Economist at Dairy NZ, Dr. Helen Rutter, who's a Senior Hydrologist at Aqualink, and Bianca Sullivan, who is presenting planning evidence on behalf of Dairy NZ. Myself, Graham and Helen will be presenting evidence on the Waimakariri zone, and then we'll be followed by Bianca and Graham presenting evidence on the OTOP zone.
Splendid. We have, of course, your original submission, and we've read that, and we have evidence statements from all four of you, I think, yes, and we've read those as well. So without confining how you present your material, this afternoon, you don't need to read out to us what you've already provided to us in writing. We've read that, but I'm not confining you, and you can present as you wish. And as you proceed through, there will be questions that we may have for you as well.
Thank you. If it is acceptable to the Chair, I'd like to just pull out some key points from the Dairy NZ hearing statement, which summarises the points in evidence.
Yes, just a moment, I'll bring that up. Thank you. Where would you like to start there?
So rather than going through the hearing statement itself, I'm paraphrasing from the hearing statement.
Thank you.
So Dairy NZ's view is that the long-term water quality outcomes are appropriate, and we support the achievement of those long-term water quality outcomes. We also consider that the 2030 proposed in-loss reductions is an appropriate first goalpost for farmers to move towards achieving those water quality outcomes. These reductions are expected to have a significant impact on the financial position of some farmers, but it is expected that it would generally provide sufficient time for farmers to transition to this lower level of in-loss. It is Dairy NZ's view that the proposed 2030 reductions should be retained. Secondly, Dairy NZ seeks that the in-loss reductions required by 2050 and beyond be deleted from the plan. The groundwater modelling used to underpin these longer-term reductions does not provide the level of certainty needed to justify the anticipated and devastating economic impacts from in-loss reductions of 45% and beyond. These impacts are expected to affect farmers immediately. Lastly, Dairy NZ seeks to retain the 2040 proposed reductions of 30% beyond baseline GMP as a regulatory backstop if insufficient progress towards water quality outcomes is being made. In Dairy NZ's view, explicitly tying progress towards water quality targets to subsequent in-loss reductions will incentivise farmers to make in-loss reductions sooner and to invest in catchment scale mitigations such as MAR, or Managed Aquifer Recharge, in advance of the 2040 target. For this reason, Dairy NZ seeks an amendment to Policy 8425 to provide a clearer linkage between progress towards water quality outcomes and further in-loss reductions. And that concludes my summary, and I'll now hand over to Dr. Graham Dool, who will cover the economic evidence on the Waimakariri zone.
Well, just first let me say how admirable your summary was of those points. Very clear and helpful, and puts us right into the focus of your submission. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Dr. Dool, we have your statement of evidence, and we've, of course, considered that, read it, and ready for you to speak to it. I just want to bring it up in front of you. So the one that I've got in front of me at the moment is the one with a green front page. Is that the one I should have?
Yes, that's definitely the one that you should have. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. If you'd like now to speak to that.
No, excellent. Thank you. So moving on to the first slide, really where I think we need to start is just considering over the last 20 years the enormous economic contribution that the dairy sector has had within Canterbury and nationally. Dairying provides a third of our merchandise exports every year and is our top export earner in many years as well, depending on product prices. But a lot of that is due to the production here in Canterbury. Our Canterbury production systems are the most productive and the most profitable per hectare across the nation. And what we've seen here across the last 20 years, I liked your example before, David, where you referred, Judge, where you referred previously to the gold rush. You know, literally we have had a large entry and a large development of the sector in the last 20 years. But you know, that has had impacts on the environment, but also what we've had within Canterbury is a very resilient level of financial contribution to the region. So for every dollar that comes in from exports from milk production within Canterbury, we have $2 flowing into other sectors. And so what we find, we have $1.5 billion per annum coming into Canterbury from dairying, but that leads to $3 billion of flow-on benefits for other sectors as farmers spend that money as well. And so really, you know, over the last, between 2000 and 2017, what we see is enormous job growth or rapid job growth in the dairy sector, especially in the Waimakariri, where it was 6%, which was, I think, 2 to 3 times the national average over that period. So moving on to my next slide, when I looked at the ECAN evidence, what I liked about Mr. Harris's summary was that he highlighted many different aspects of the potential impacts, economic impacts of the policy on dairy farms. What I'd like to just spell out today is some nuance, adding some nuance to his arguments. One thing that we found in Mr. Harris's evidence was that he focused on average farms. And so what I've done within my evidence is I've really focused on trying to represent the impacts across the individual farms, because, you know, I've been working on farms for a long time. You know, grew up on a farm, worked on farms, studied farms for about 20 years now, and I've never encountered an average farm. And especially when we look at policy, policy often impacts the tail, so the least profitable farms and the farms with the most debt. And so sometimes what we see when we look at the average farm is that we tend to underestimate the true impact of the policy. So here, this is just some examples within these graphs which are detailed more within my evidence, where I seek to explain the variation within the Waimakariri, where we see, enormous differences in terms of milk production per hectare, farm size, cow number, and the amount of nitrogen surplus, and hence leaching as well. So you would have seen within my evidence a series of modelling scenarios. I'll run through some of the key results today, just to kind of retouch over some of the key points that I raise. Really what I was focused on was 3 scenarios, which was no limits, which was really an unconstrained world where we had no GMP policy, no limits, and so farming was continuing without bound, so to speak. But then we have a GMP, or very much aligned with Plan Change 5. And then Plan Change, and then in our third scenario, this is where we focused on GMP plus the proposed Plan Change 7 on top of that. And we forecast the impacts across 2030, 2040 and 2050. The key really the key parts that I'd like to draw from my evidence today are really the impacts of moving from GMP to the proposed Plan Change 7 scenario. So those are the ones that I will speak about. So I'm moving to the next slide where we have a number of coloured bars. I'd just like to focus really on the green bars here, and I'd also like to highlight that the blue bar has changed in magnitude. If you have an earlier version of the slides, sorry, there was a small error in that, but we've rectified that here. And what we see, but really the key focus here is the change in the green bars anyway. The green bar denotes the percentage change in operating profit forecast to occur across the entire Waimakariri catchment because of the nitrogen limits within the nitrate priority areas. So in 2030 we see an 11% decrease in farm profit. In 2040 we see about 20%, and in 2050 we see around 26 or 27%. So those reductions are quite large. You know, I have studied the costs of mitigation on dairy farms for the last decade, and these costs are significant, but they do not surprise me given the magnitude that we're talking about, and that is the magnitude of the proposed Plan Change 7 limits on top of what GMP requires across the individuals in the farms. My next point is a table. My next slide contains a table, and it focuses here on proposed Plan Change 7. This is showing the difference from the baseline. What really I'm emphasising here, we have the on-farm cost in terms of millions. So in 2030 we see the farm cost is about 21 million across the entire catchment. In 2040, we see under the column of farm cost. In 2040, we see the cost on farm across the catchment is 32 million, and in 2050, we see the cost as 41 million. But if we move to the next column to the right of that, where it says other sectors, under a higher title under a column heading of Waimakariri District, what we see is an inflation. You know, really, once we take that money out of dairy farming, you know, the groceries aren't being bought, the agricultural support services aren't being purchased, and so we see those flow-on impacts of around 30 million in 2030, around 50 million in 2040, and around 60 million in 2050. What this is really emphasising is just as the economic health of the region has benefited from the increase in dairy production in the last 20 years, what we see here is actually the reverse. As we constrain production and constrain profit on a dairy farm, those regional benefits aren't flowing on. And this is what we'd expect as well. This is not a new form of analysis. With constraints around environmental constraints, especially of this magnitude, these flow-on benefits are to be expected. So my next slide is talking about the ability to service debt. I really enjoyed the last submitter who spoke about, he mentioned the effect of the proposed Plan Change 7 on asset value and also debt. What this graph here looks at is the amount of earnings before tax. So this is operating profit, the amount of profit we make from dairy farms, after we consider mitigation cost because of policy, after we consider the living expenses that are required for the farmer to support his family, and also after the debt payments. We have around 70% of our dairy sector right now, maybe just a little bit less, around 66, 68%, are still paying only interest on their loans. We know that in the next 5 or 10 years, within our dairy sector, because of our, we're seen as a high-risk sector in terms of our high debt burden, which is in the area of around 38 to 40 billion now nationally. We know that because of that, we will be required to pay principal increasingly across the farming population. What we find currently within our sector is about between 50 and 75% of our profit is paid towards debt, which is a very high level. And this is what we see within this graph here. So if we look at this graph, each dot is actually a farm within each scenario. So if we look at the first red box, it's a box plot, and the middle line within each box is the median, or if we sorted all farms from lowest value to the highest value, it's the one bang smack in the middle. The bottom of the box is the 25th percentile, which is halfway between the bottom farm and the middle farm, and the top of the box is the 75th percentile, which is halfway between the middle farm and the maximum value. That black line within this graph is very important because it shows the level of zero earnings before tax. So before the farmer earns tax, pays his tax, this is how much the farmer owes after he's paid his living expenses, his debt, his mitigation cost. What we see for that red box is that by 2030, around 50% of the farmers within the catchment will be struggling to pay their existing levels of debt, even with some efficiency gains. And so that pressure, that pressure is not new. We know that's coming. We expect that. But really, the big thing that I'd like to emphasise here is that on top of that dynamic, if we add mitigation cost to it, then we see the box representing the distribution of the population shifts down, and this is not even considering milk price volatility. So this effect of mitigation cost on top of the increased debt payments is so significant that what we see is around 83% of farmers in this catchment are forecast to not be able to service their debt annually by 2030, and that value is around 80% in 2040 and around 75% in 2050. And what we see here is that if farmers are unable to cover their costs, they will usually draw on their debt further, and this will lead to a downward spiral. And so more detail around that is present within my evidence, but that's really a key dynamic, is that this policy is not occurring in isolation. It's occurring on top of what dairy farms will be required to do under the zero carbon bill, under pricing for greenhouse gas emissions, under an increased requirement to pay principal payments, and also commodity price volatility, which, for example, we had $3.92 in 2015-16. We had a milk price of $3.92, and now it's around $6.50, $6.60. But it's quite enormous, the variation we experience as a sector. And another point which I found, ECAN, Mr. Harris for ECAN highlighted a very interesting dynamic and a very expected dynamic, and also the last submitted mentioned this as well, is that proposed Plan Change 7 will reduce asset prices. Land values have grown in this region between 6 to 8% a year for the last 20 or 30 years. We've had substantial capital gain here, but that means people who have invested late have had to borrow a lot of money to purchase these farms. But what we find is that because of the reduced opportunities and the higher uncertainty related to proposed Plan Change 7, what we'll see is quite a large lost opportunity in terms of capital gain. What I'd like to point out is in 2050, if we look at the red box in 2050, on the box plot, we see that the median value is around $24 million for the median farm in the district. However, it's equal to about 16 to 18 million under proposed Plan Change 7 because of the reduced opportunities available to the farmer. So that is putting pressure on the balance sheet for the farm, that capital gain, and that capital gain is being arrested. And we've even seen farms within this district fall in value on average by around 10 or 12% in the last 12 months. They've been quite stable for the last 4 or 5 years. However, in the last year, they have fallen quite markedly. So really what we find, really one of my kind of overarching points here, is that with the decrease in operating profit and the inability to pay debt, plus also the decrease in asset value, what we will see is what I predict to be quite a significant jump within the debt to asset ratio of the farms within this district. Usually a debt to asset ratio of about 25% is considered good. 50% is average for the sector, around 60% is average for Canterbury. Above 90% is considered high risk for insolvency. This black line on this figure signifies high risk, so any dots above that black line signify a farm at high risk of insolvency. What we see, if we look out to 2050, if we look at the blue box, which is proposed plan change 7, we see the number of farms above the black line growing in each subsequent period, given that the nitrogen limits are starting to affect profit to a greater extent because of the tighter limits defined within the nitrate priority areas. But really, if we think about it, the percentage of high-risk farms under proposed plan change 7 increase above GMP by 5% in 2030, around 10% in 2040, and around 15% in 2050. My last slide talks to the accelerated proposed plan change 7 that we saw mentioned in the section 42A. So this outlined it contained the same limits but adopted at an accelerated pace. So the accelerated proposed plan change 7, for example, had a 30% limit by 2030, a 45% limit by 2040. When we analysed that within our economic modelling, what we found was that fast onset just brought on those quite significant impacts. It brought them on so they occurred more rapidly. And that had quite a, as you would understand, based on my previous slides, it had a more pronounced effect, a faster, more pronounced impact in the short term. So if we look at the table here, it touches on farm viability. We see in 2030 we have 14% extra farms can't pay debt above GMP, and 13% of farms have a debt to asset ratio above 90%. If we look at 2040, we have a quarter of farms unable to pay their debt above GMP, and also 20% of farms who are in the high risk category. These are even worse. At 2050, we have nearly a third of farms that can't pay their debt above GMP, and we also have nearly 30% classified as high risk above GMP. So really, this work, what I think overall, what I've highlighted is that the dairy sector has had a very important role within the growth, the recent economic growth of the Waimakariri district. There's a lot of farming families here, but there's also a lot of debt here. I think there's around $780 million worth of debt in the Waimakariri district in the dairy sector alone, and so really I think this emphasises the importance or the significance of a careful and a considered transition, so we don't place these businesses at undue risk of failure. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Dould, thank you very much for that summary of the position, and I acknowledge that we've had the full detail of it in your evidence as well. Is it convenient if we ask any questions we've got about that separately from other questions? Will that suit you all right?
Yes, I think that's what we would prefer.
Yes, very well. So, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Dr. Dould?
Yeah, thank you. Just turning to your evidence itself. And my first question just derives from your paragraph 5.12 on page 6. You've got two 5.12, so I'm talking about the first one.
Oh no, they're numbered. Sorry, there's a one has a
5.2.1,
subsection.
isn't it?
Yes,
So, yeah,
5.12.
So the question is, in relation to the effects of GMP. Can you explain why does GMP continue to drive down profit over time? Why doesn't it stabilise?
Oh, sorry, I just within a certain figure. Do you mean within figure one? Sorry.
Yeah, within figure one.
No, I
or
think,
is it figure two that you referred to in that? Oh, figure one. You
figure one. Sorry, figure one is the correct one. But what we actually see within that, if we look at the box, if we look at figure one, which is paragraph 5.10, we actually see that it remains stable. We actually find profit is actually going up, although marginally. So the green box plot, median profit, is increasing across time, or it's increasing slightly.
I was just reading your 5.12 where it says figure one shows that GMP reduces median profit below base by 25% and 35% in 2030 and 2040.
Yes.
So is that in relation to the table 8.9 reduction
it's
target?
what I can explain, sorry, that particular text. If we look, so what I state there in paragraph 5.12 is that GMP reduces below the base profit by 25% in 2030 and then 35% in 2040. The reason why that cost is increasing, even though GMP is quite stable, is that base profit is increasing over time. If we have a look at the figure one, we see that the red bars, or the box, the distribution of profit for farms is increasing under the red scenario, but for green is quite stable. What's underlying that is an assumption of efficiency growth within our dairy sector of 1.5% growth in profit per year. If we look at the last 30 years, estimates of our efficiency growth, so when I talk about efficiency, I'm talking producing more, making more profit from the same amount of cost, and what we find is that historically our gains have been pretty dismal, really. We've produced our average operating profit in New Zealand has grown by 5% per year for the last 30 years. However, our efficiency has been stagnant. Our growth has been driven by higher input use, and so given the greenhouse gas restrictions and various water quality restrictions, what we will see is efficiency gains. What I think is efficiency gains. So what I've done here is within the base scenario, I've assumed, given the need to reduce methane and other, particularly under the zero carbon bill, and also the limited opportunities for input growth, we've assumed a baseline of 1.5% per annum efficiency growth. So as we see baseline profit going up and GMP becoming stable, we find that loss is growing.
That was a really long answer. So just briefly summarise why the GMP remains stable again, just in one or two sentences.
Yes, that the farms are required. The GMP for a given farm is fixed, and the GMP for a farm is fixed. We assume that the farms move to GMP and then stay there, but we find that the profit is quite stable across time because there's also some efficiency growth that we've assumed within GMP. So you'll find profit in there increases over time, but more slowly than under the base scenario.
Just rolling on, paragraph 8.3. And your assumption there, 4 lines down, that all farmers will be required to repay principal on outstanding loans. Does that mean commence paying principal or pay off all the principal?
No, commence paying principal.
Okay.
Yes, we have around 2/3 not paying principal currently, and we're assuming here that every farmer will have to start paying principal.
And you mentioned the total debt in the dairy sector in New Zealand. I can't remember the number you said. Was it 38 billion or 48
yes,
billion?
It's around 38 to 40 billion. It's come.
That's across the country.
Across the country.
And in the YMAC, it's 780 million.
Around that, yes.
Okay. Just in light of that, I mean, it's a very simple question. Does that mean that some dairy farmers have simply borrowed too much money?
I think we've had a remarkable, with the last 20 or 30 years has seen a remarkable transition within our sector, and a lot of that transition has been funded by debt, and asset prices have grown very quickly over that period. That period is finished now, and at the moment, if we look at the position of these farms, it is very difficult for them to service debt, especially once they're required to pay principal. And so I agree with you is that there's a lot of farms now carrying too much debt, and I think that emphasises the need for a careful and considered transition.
So that's a yes.
Yes, and I think I said that at the end.
Yeah.
Sorry, Commissioner. Yes,
That's
right. But I think also it requires qualification. They have borrowed a lot of money. There's a lot of money, but I think that just serves to emphasise the need.
Sure. Yep, understand that.
Yep. Sorry.
So just at 9.5, I just want to understand the simulated farm population that you've based all your graphs on.
Yes.
So the little dots represent farms, but they're not real farms. They're simulated farms, but the number of farms in the plots is correct.
Matches the farms, but also also as much detail as we could about the base population we've employed. So, any information we had around nitrogen leaching, hectares, we spoke to various experts, but then what we've also done is utilise a large data set of farms in Canterbury that we have available for the last decade to inform as well.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to confirm my understanding was correct, because when I initially just glanced through your evidence and I saw all the plots, I thought, these are real farms. That's really helpful.
Yes,
then when I read on, I thought, no, they're not real farms.
No, they're as real as we can get, but they're not real.
No, I understand that. So page 17, figure 5, and
yes.
You've got the debt to asset ratio, the black line being the line where, that's the line of concern. Most of the dots above the black line are outside of the box, which means they're outliers. What are the implications of that?
Yes, yes. What that's showing is 25%. Yes. So if we look at the blue box, which is proposed plan change 7 impacts in 2050. Yes, what we'll notice is 25% of those farms are above are outside of the box. I think the implication of that is that it's showing that the impact of a tight, stringent, the implications of a stringent nitrogen limit in 2050 are quite marked in terms of debt position for these farms. Does that answer your question?
No, what I was getting at when I was looking at that graph, given that anything outside the box is what I, in lay terms, would call an outlier in terms of a data set. And given that all the ones that appear to be in trouble are in sort of the outlier category, does that mean that, generally the farmers aren't in that bad a position when you consider all the ones above the black line are in that outlier bracket?
Yeah, I think the important part here is to see the whisker on top of the box plot.
Yeah.
Technically, any dots above that whisker are outliers.
Right.
So if we look at that so there's about 8 outliers, but what we find there is that there are a lot of farms along the whisker which say there is broad variation, and what that is showing is just really a very high debt, is basically a lot of farms getting further and further following the downward spiral. These numbers are actually artificially high because in the model we don't have farms disappearing as the debt to asset ratio goes above 100, because usually those farms would become insolvent given their inability, given that a bank would, they would be classified as non-performing and they would exit. Here, because we don't have farms exiting, their debt to asset ratio just grows and grows.
Just a couple more. Page 29, so skipping over quite a long way now. Oops. Yep. So when I look at that data set there, and given table 8-9 and plan change 7, the 2030 numbers are for dairy 15% reduction in leaching. So when I look at that graph there, 15% isn't plotted, but if I run my finger up there, is it a reasonable conclusion to draw that at a 15% reduction in nitrogen leaching, operating profit drops less than 10%?
I think that in the context of this figure, I believe that would be incorrect. And the reason that is because this nitrogen reduction in nitrogen leaching is not only the additional reduction under proposed plan change 7, it is additional to that required to reach GMP as well. And so GMP requires quite a broad range of nitrogen reductions for some farms. I think within our Dairy NZ report that I refer to in my evidence, it ranged from 0% to 69%. So that 15% for some farms is on top of some distribution. And so I could, if I
another question then. So in terms of that figure A3, so sitting in behind there is the change in operating profit that's already occurred to bring a farm to GMP. So this is on top of that?
No, so this is the change. This is without any GMP.
Right.
So what we must do here is what is the reduction in profit, reduction in nitrogen required under GMP? What is the reduction required under proposed plan change 7? And then we put that along the bottom, and then we we work out what that is in terms of total reduction in leaching, and then we look at the associated point.
Okay. And so I can't work that out myself, can I, just by looking at that?
No, but one thing I would like to point you to is figure 2, which is on page 7 of my evidence.
Just a minute. Yep.
What you see there, paragraph 513, is you see the distribution of nitrogen required for the farms within the catchment, or within the district.
Right,
That is the distribution of nitrogen reductions required under GMP. So we see it's very broadly distributed.
Yeah. And when you say under GMP, that's what's required to get to GMP?
Yes, to get to GMP, sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. No, that's good. So I'll just write that down. And just one final question. Let me find it. Page 31, just in terms of some of your assumptions, and so right at the bottom you say all loans are assumed to be set for a 30-year period, interest rate of 6%. I just know that all my friends with mortgages are paying way less than 6% at the moment. Is that a realistic assumption?
Do you know that this is one of the one part of I'm the principal economist at Dairy NZ, and part of my day job is trying to deal with that difference. You know, that is a very significant difference. There's the housing loans market is very competitive. We find I think the average interest rate, the spread of interest rates paid by dairy farmers goes from 2.5 right up to 8. Like I was talking to a farmer the other day who's paying 7.5, and it's a function of the risk that the Reserve Bank sees our dairy sector holding at the moment, but also it also has to do with the lack of competition in that loan market.
So with the farmers who have those higher interest rates up around the 8%, is that related to they might have a lower degree of equity, so they've got a bigger debt load, so they're more risky?
Yes, it's often related to their low equity and also some cash flow as well. Their cash flow, their level of profit at an average milk price, and also at a below average milk price, will be leading them to be classified as high risk, which beggars belief sometimes, but they will be required to pay more in interest. But I can see the logic, but it seems perverse.
And that will just kind of compound the problems that your graphs
Yes, exactly, yes.
Don't takes someone in a bad position and puts them in a worse position.
Yes.
All right. No, thanks very much for that. I just wanted, yeah, they were the only things I wanted to clarify from the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions of Dr. Dool?
Yes, I just have one question. You describe the rising costs of compliance and how that's going to affect farm profit and impact on farm debt. But do you think that's the actual costs to farm? Whereas in the past, when attention didn't need to be paid to environmental effects, it was kind of a utopia.
Yes. Just trying to think through your statement. I think really, I think really the important point there is, yeah, there's a change in social licence, or if we can call it that, or a change in public perception. Is that, yes, in the past, when the dairy sector has grown in the last 20 years within Canterbury, some of those, we've done a lot of good work, like we've spent more than $1 billion nationally on environmental improvement, and we've seen earlier evidence that the groundwater nitrate levels improved after more wide-scale use of irrigation, as we see throughout the country. So we've done a lot of good, but also at the same time, if the social licence changes and we must reduce nitrogen leaching and greenhouse gas emissions, then yeah, that's additional cost that we have to pay.
And just, have you read the submission from Mr. Robin Fraser and Dr. Timothy Chambers from Christchurch City Council? Their submissions talk about the health effects of nitrates.
I'm sorry, I have not read those.
I would suggest you read them because they're really sobering to read.
Yes.
And it gives you the other side of the story, and it also explains what we as a commission have to have before us and the decisions we've got to make.
Yes, and that's what I accept within my analysis. I looked at the cost of reaching a certain limit. I didn't estimate the benefits side, because associated with nitrate reductions, I haven't done the work to inform that, but there will be, if the policy is well designed, which is outside of my expertise to really comment on. If we do see improvement in the water, then there are benefits associated with that. So no, I agree. That would be interesting to read. So no, that's a point well taken, and I excluded that from my analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Dool. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Dr. Dool. There's something that you were mentioning a moment or two ago, which I thought was helpful to my thinking, when you were referring to the social licence, the public perception, which of course is very positive for an industry that produces healthy food in great quantities and exports a lot of it, and it's a major asset to society as a whole. At the same time, of course, regional councils are being required by the law to take effective action to reduce these, what would you call them, outputs from the dairy industry. And what might have been thought to be a reasonable period in which to do that effectively 5 years ago is no longer being seen as in public perception as being acceptable anymore. And there's pressure, for instance, in the new national policy statement on freshwater management and in recent environment court decisions and so forth. The pressure is that effects need to be achieved earlier, and is the solution to that the industry is going to have more incentive to find technical solutions in terms of the different pastures and different genetic developments and so forth, so that they can, in fact, do better than you were thinking of when you created these clear and dramatic graphs for us.
Yes, I think there's 2 points that I would really like to point out. Is that one, like we have considered, I've worked in this area a long time. During my time as an economic advisor with the New Zealand government, we did a lot of work within trying to think about the costs at the national level and the regional level of dairy's footprint. And what we saw there is there are no silver bullets. But I agree. What excites me, what the reason why I work for the sector is what is exactly that evolutionary force that you talk about. Is that we need that evolution. Our systems do have to change, and we are changing. And that's where I think my other point is really around social license. I think some people have quite there's some public perception that the dairy industry has been. It's seen quite negatively by some, but at the same time, our economic contribution, especially in Canterbury here, it has been remarkable. And so I think it's important that we don't forget that. Like at the end of the day, we do have an important economic contribution to the region, and we need, and that's required, especially in rural areas where other sources of income are harder to attain. And the other point as well is that I think, our social licence, people don't really recognise how much work dairy farmers have actually done, especially around riparian planting. Like we've tried, but also I do realise that we do have to go further. And that's why, I believe those 2030 reductions are in line with, seem like a very good step for improving water quality. But at the same time, we do have to think about the long-term costs, especially because there are no silver bullets here. And in terms of silver bullet, a big one is that an alternative land use that is as profitable as dairy farming at scale. We don't have that yet. And, I'm from a sheep farm. I think the previous submitter said that dryland sheep farming is not much fun. We've done it for 150 years, and I can confirm his statement.
Well, thank you very much. So, is it convenient if we now go to Dr. Rutter's evidence?
Thank you.
Did want to take a break at any point. Afternoon teas at the back of the room.
Oh. Would people like to have a quarter of an hour's break before we start with Dr. Rutter?
Yeah, that'd be good, thanks.
All right, we'll just have a break for a quarter of an hour, and then we will come back to Dr. Rutter. Yes, Dr. Rutter, thank you for the statement of evidence, and we read that with interest, and I believe you're now going to present a summary with slides.
Yeah, if that's all right, thank you. Yeah, so I will try and get through these reasonably quickly. I realise time is dragging on a little. So really, what I want to do is just highlight some of the main issues that I perceive with this work. One of the main issues I find is the lack of data for the deeper aquifers, including aquifer properties and piezometric data. The other thing I would raise in my evidence, then there's a whole load of things that follow on from that lack of data for the deeper aquifer. The next thing I covered in my evidence was differences between measured groundwater nitrate data and many of the model predictions. And then the last 2 points are really around peer review of the model and the apparent concerns from some of the expert panel members who provided input into the modelling, and leading on to what can we do about it, which is really, we identified through caucusing that there's a real need for a specific monitoring plan and adaptive management in response to that monitoring data. So first of all, I'll just cover off what I think we do know, just in terms of what we got in terms of measured data. In terms of groundwater levels and flow direction, as I said, there's very limited deep groundwater level data. We've got an abundance of shallow groundwater data, and ECAN, through their sort of their data collection exercise and gap filling, trying to fill in some of those gaps with the deeper data. One of the issues with that is that there's the range in groundwater levels that you get for some of the deeper wells in the Waimakariri area is quite large. It can be anything up to about 30 metres in terms of range between minimum and maximum groundwater levels. So in doing that gap filling, we can introduce bias if, for example, you get a couple of measurements from a time when there was very low groundwater levels or very high groundwater levels. That can obviously have quite a big influence. So although some of those gaps are being filled with measured data, it's not the ideal when you create a piezometric survey is to get all the data on the same date or similar dates so that you've got something that's comparable. And if you introduce data from other dates, then you might get these levels that are too high or too low, which can then influence the flow directions that you might derive from that data. The top right figure there, it's not entirely clear, but you can just about see there's a few data points. That is the deep data. So what I did was pull out the wells from a greater than 100 metres that ECAN surveyed on their September 2007 piezometric survey. So there's obviously some big gaps in the data there. And like I said, those were then filled with this gap filling exercise. If you just use those data there, to the west of that diagram, if you interpolated that data just with no controls on it whatsoever, just using that, which I wouldn't ever really want to do, to the west of the figure, then you'd get flow towards the southwest, but certainly from around the Airwell Forest area, just based on that data alone, the flow is towards the east. I didn't introduce this before because I only obtained the data relatively recently. So the next point was evidence for nitrate transfer pathway at depth. What ECAN did here was take the specific capacity of wells. So the specific capacity is the amount of drawdown you get relative to the rate you pump out, and it's an indication of permeability. But as I've said in my evidence, there's a whole load of issues around using specific capacity data instead of permeability or transmissivity. But they took the specific capacity of wells to indicate the permeability, and then hence the opportunity for deep transfer pathway from the Waimak towards the Solent, Waihora, Christchurch, and Smelton zones. The top figure there on the right shows you the distribution of wells that we used. So what ECAN did was take all of those and look at the distribution in different depth bins of a specific capacity. I just pulled out the ones north of the Waimak and had a look at the specific capacity distribution for those. And if you're looking at all of them, in that bottom right figure, the blue bars show you the specific capacity per depth range for all of those wells. But if you just look at the Waimakariri zone, the orange bar shows you all of them. If you look at the Waimakariri zone, the blue bars come right down, and beyond about 150 metres depth, the specific capacity data doesn't indicate there's high permeability at depth at all. Like I said, specific capacity has got its own issues anyway in terms of it doesn't actually truly represent permeability, but it's an indication of it. So like I said, if you just pull out the wells from the north of the Waimakariri River, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of a deep rapid transfer pathway for nitrates. As was raised earlier, this figure came from a 2016 report from ECAN, and that report basically summarised that there was generally nothing major happening in terms of groundwater trends, quality trends in the Waimakariri zone over the past few decades. One of the things, once you start to look at groundwater quality going further south in the Christchurch West Melton zone, is that you can see a real obvious demarcation between the river recharge dominated groundwater quality in the northeast and land surface recharge dominated in the southwest. And that's in that figure there. So I've sort of slightly arbitrarily drawn a line across based on, I looked at 6 decades of data, 60 years of data, and just pulled out the average nitrate concentration per well over each decade, and then plotted it for each decade. And that pattern with those low nitrates on the northeast, higher nitrates and increasing nitrates in the southwest. That pattern is just consistent over 60 years of data. So you can, one of the issues that ECAN commented on was the Russley bore, or it's actually two bores because one was decommissioned and another one was brought in. You can see the location of the Russley bores by that vertical arrow. It's about the middle of the Christchurch West Milton zone, and it's right on that line that separates that sort of river recharge dominated zone from the land surface recharge dominated zone there. So the Russley bore shows, the data is shown underneath the map, and it shows a very slight increase in trend over many years. There are some spikes in it, which are a little bit unusual for a bore of that depth, but very slowly increasing in trend. This could show in evidence of land surface recharge impacts at that particular location. But I don't consider that that's particularly an indication of flow into the Waimakariri. It could possibly also be due to land surface recharge south of the Waimakariri River. It's just on the edge of that zone that's dominated by land surface recharge. The other odd area is up in the Belfast Kayang area. And up there's, in a well at greater than 100 metres depth, there does appear to be some increase in nitrate concentrations. And if you look at the lower right diagram there, the yellow dots are showing that there is an increase in nitrate at greater than 100 metres depth. The problem is that all those yellow dots, which look a bit alarming if you're looking at a time series, are actually all from that one well in Belfast, which hadn't been sampled up to that date, but suddenly came into the sampling regime. So although it looks like you've got a sudden and quite dramatic increase in nitrates based on those yellow dots, that is simply due to that one well being brought into the sampling regime. There is something, and I've talked about this in my evidence, there is something going on up in that northeastern area of Christchurch. There's certainly some indications of land surface recharge from the end-member mixing analysis, from isotopes, from somewhat increased nitrates. But there doesn't appear to be any agreement as to whether that's an indication of flow under the Waimak or whether it's actually something more local, south of the Waimakariri. And that was actually commented on by some of the experts at the workshop that was held. So that's sort of really just looking at what data are available. So just moving on to some of the issues that I've mentioned in my evidence. As I said earlier, most data is from the shallow aquifer layers, and there's very limited deep data. I've discussed that a little bit already, so I won't go into that anymore right now. I raised some issues with the variography that was used to infer the preferential flow direction. I went into quite some detail in my evidence about the variography and some of the limitations of the data that's used to support it. But then also, what we don't really know, the influence, what the variography was used for was to infer a preferential flow direction, and then that was imposed in the model. But we don't really know how much of an influence of that has had on the modelling. One of the other issues that appeared to happen was the model appears to over-predict deep groundwater levels in the Irwell Forest area, and it looks to be by about 20 metres. So if it's only over-predicting groundwater levels in that area and not in other areas, there's obviously going to be some impact on the overall flow direction that's predicted. Just talking about differences between measured concentrations and model predictions. I totally agree that you can't expect any model to accurately represent measured concentrations. There's always going to be uncertainties in inputs. There's always going to be a need to account for any lag time. But one of the things that myself and some of the other experts found was when you actually look at measured data at specific locations, so in this case it's Waimakariri District Council wells, and in other cases they've looked at the private water supply areas, the model seems to consistently over-predict compared to what we're measuring, even when some of those lag times are quite fast. So there's a couple of examples at the bottom there. The left-hand example is at Fernside, and we often really just don't have enough measured data to really be able to say much, but at Fernside over a period of, I think that was 2 or 3 decades, there isn't any evidence that concentrations are increasing. Admittedly, you've only got 2 points. Sorry. The lag time there was predicted to be about 20 years, and according to the model and good management practice, the predictions in terms of nitrates were supposed to be 4.6 milligrams a litre. And it's obviously nothing like that. Those concentrations, the first one was 2 and the second one was about 1. So it's not, even with that relatively short lag time, it's not showing any dramatic increase in nitrates. The second example is from Waikuku, and there's about 45 years of data there. All of those nitrate concentrations are well less than 1 milligram a litre, and generally they're around about 0.4 milligrams a litre. But again, the modelling is suggesting that Waikuku would be expected to get up to 2 or 3 milligrams a litre. And in that case, the lag time is estimated to be 6 years. So again, a very short lag time. In terms of peer review, I think it was agreed at caucusing that there's insufficient documentation about the peer review process of the model. We were unclear how much peer review had been done, but it appears some has been done, but it's not been that well documented, which then does have the consequence of reducing confidence in the outputs. And finally, in terms of looking forward, probably the most practical way to think about doing things is just to really think about how we can specifically monitor so that we can assess whether we're achieving objectives. So yeah, it's fine to put initial rules in place, but let's get some robust monitoring going. And that could be including things like groundwater levels, surface water flows, nitrate concentrations, and also, importantly, fill in gaps where we really just don't know what's happening because there were no data points at all. And ideally, you'd want to collect data. It might be over the next 10 or 20 years, but also look at improving and updating the model so that we can have more confidence in the model results. And that's the end of my summary. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all of the care you've taken in preparing this all for us, Dr. Rutter, and for your participation in the caucusing as well. There will still be perhaps some questions for you, and I'll see if Commissioner van Verthausen has questions first.
Yeah, thank you. Just starting with the PowerPoint presentation first, the very last slide, slide 13.
Okay, sorry.
Just the second bullet point. Put initial rules in place. What do you mean by initial rules?
Oh, I just really meant we could put the plan in place now with all the rules that are associated with it. But I'm in agreement with Charlotte that beyond a certain point, we haven't got the confidence that that we're going to get what's expected. But also, if we could do better, if we do lots of monitoring, if we show that nitrate concentrations are reducing, then at some point we shouldn't be enforcing further and further reductions. You've got to take into account the fact that what you're doing is actually working. So I was really meaning more put the plan in place for the time being, but don't expect to. In my opinion, I would say we're trying to extrapolate too far into the future with the data that we've got available.
Drill into a little bit more. When you say put the plan in place as it is now, there's table 8-9 with the nitrogen reductions required in the Waimakariri high nitrogen areas. So what do you mean by that? Do you mean implement the full table as notified?
I would say we're going through a process. Implement the plan as agreed through this process, but then ultimately make sure that we've got the monitoring in place, that we know what's happening, and that we can have more confidence in the modelling as we go through to the future.
Someone put table 8-9 in front of you, please. From the plan.
I'm not sure.
Has someone got the copy of the plan? We can put in front of Dr. Arata. So that's the nitrogen reductions as notified going out from 2030 out to 2080.
Yeah.
So when you say put the initial rules in place, do you mean all of that table or just some of that?
I actually meant put in place whatever comes out through this process. Those are what's being proposed at the moment. They may get adjusted through the hearing process. I guess my point was really more, we can put those in place now, whether it's those exact targets or whether they change. But if we don't monitor and if we don't keep assessing what is happening, then we're going to move forward and forward and forward with increasing nitrate reductions without any evidence as to whether or not the rules are working or not working or anything. So my point is more about just making sure that we have a robust monitoring plan in place and someone looking at the data and using it to make sure that we're getting the results that are anticipated.
Just turning now to your main evidence. Yeah, I just want to ask you about figure 17, which is on page 39.
Yeah.
So in the shallow wells, 0 to 40 metres, the blue lines,
Yeah.
from 1990 onwards, showing an increase. What do you attribute that to?
It's obviously land use impacts. Those are dominated by those wells in the southwestern side of Christchurch when I showed that plan view. So those are the increasing land surface recharge impacts on those wells is what's driving that increase in those shallower wells. It's I looked at the data on a well by well basis as well, and it's very, very marked in the Selwyn Christchurch West Melton zone. The increase in nitrates only occurs really above the 50 metre and less than 50 metre depths. It's really quite marked, the difference between the shallower depths and the deeper ones in that particular zone. But those increases are due to land surface recharge impacts. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go on in the area. It's not only dairying; it's things like meatworks, any other land use activities. It could be in places septic tanks.
So land surface recharge, is that north or south of the river that you're talking about?
I'm talking about land surface recharge south of the river.
Yeah.
You see that same pattern going all the way down through the Selwyn zone.
Yeah.
And you see, in the Ashburn zone we've got less data from the earlier years, but you see a massive increase since the 1980s, and that's just local land surface recharge.
Do septic tanks have a high level of nitrogen in their discharge?
I think it depends how well they're maintained and used and everything. Under Darfield area, you've got deep depths, you've got nitrates of getting on for drinking water quality standards up around the 8, 9, 10 milligrams a litre, and you can have attributed that to septic tanks, and that's at 200 metres depth. So yeah, they obviously can contribute to high nitrates.
Paragraph 12.12. So, for me, this is a key part of your evidence. You say we cannot discount the hypothesis that there is flow at depth under the Waimakariri River. Given that the potential impacts of that on the deep groundwater that Christchurch City accesses for its drinking water, does that mean that we should take a precautionary approach, or at least a cautious approach, given that there's a high potential impact of the groundwater level having its increased levels of nitrogen, given that we can't rule that out?
To some extent, yeah. I think that's sort of encapsulated in the fact that let's do more monitoring and understand what's happening better. Like I said, over 60 years, there's no indication that there is an increase in nitrates in deep groundwater under Christchurch, other than potentially that slight increase at the Russley Well, and there's something odd going on up at Belfast. But over the most of that river-dominated part of Christchurch, there hasn't been any significant change over 60-odd years. We certainly need more data, and I guess that's what I keep coming back to.
I guess I should just qualify my question in case you didn't get the drift. So when I say precautionary approach or a cautious approach, that's with regard to regulating land use that may be contributing to increase in nitrogen levels in groundwater. So my question was, given that we cannot discount the hypothesis that there's flow at depth under the river, should we take a I guess, a cautious approach and err on the side of regulating land use rather than not regulating it. That was my question.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I guess ultimately that's probably the route you've got to go. But like I said, with more monitoring so that we actually understand what is happening, and as we get more information available, then we're probably in a much better position to understand. And I guess that's partly why Dairy NZ has taken the attitude of going with the plan for the first few years, and then sort of suggesting that we reassess later on.
Now, I just had a couple of questions from your summary statement. And it's right near the end, and it's actually in the summary of your summary statement that you prepared after you did your primary evidence. So it's 8.1D, which is page 11.
Yeah.
If it's a local source, so first of all, in terms of the deep groundwater, how deep's deep?
Well, the ECAN, that bar graph that I showed you suggested that at depths of greater than 250 metres there was evidence of high permeability at depth. My point there was that when I separated out those wells north of the WRRP from the rest of them, there wasn't any evidence of any higher permeability at depth. And I think mine, when I separated it out, because of the lack of data north of the WRRP, it's actually, once you get beyond 150 metres depth, the specific capacity values drop down significantly.
Sorry, just to stop you there. So just in terms of 8.1D, deep means greater than 200, is that what you said?
250.
250. In terms of the ECAN plot showing increased permeability at depth, that was 250.
In that same paragraph, local source, what does local source mean?
That was something that I think it may have come up from, it was a comment, I think, from one of the experts on the panel. It's something more local than across the WRRP area, so it's more land surface recharge on the south side of the river rather than the north side. Local could also mean something like a specific point source relatively close to that well. We don't know enough about that particular area, and that's one area I think needs a lot more investigation.
So just to help me understand what local source means, if we have a deep well, 250 metres deep, how far away, and then we come up to the ground, how far away would this local source be?
No one can. If that particular well is about 100 metres deep, but it's a little bit of an unknown. If there's something like a passage down the outside of the casing, then the local source could be really close to the wellhead. But it could be some contaminating activity that's been occurring in the area for tens of years and managed to get down to depth. Like I said, that at Darfield, you're getting high nitrates at 200 metres depth, which has been attributed to septic tanks within the Darfield area. So in that case, it is very local. But we don't know without doing further work.
Right. And why I asked those two initial questions was I was really curious about how something from a local source close to a very deep groundwater well could influence the water 150, 200 metres down, given there's probably some form of confining layers in the middle. So I just didn't understand how that could actually even happen.
Well, for example, the confining layers go to a certain point somewhere on the western side of Christchurch, so you have got a multi-layered aquifer system, and then those confining layers pinch out. It's due to the fact that the coastline moved in and out over historical time. So a local source might actually be beyond those confining layers on the area where you're getting downward flow and land surface recharge effects, sort of further up in the Christchurch West Melton zone, that's then flowing down at depth. But we don't know.
And last question, 8.5 of your summary statement. when there is confidence that the objectives are being achieved, so what were the objectives, first of all?
Okay, so I probably worded that quite badly. I mean, it's what the point I was making on my final slide, really. When we know that we're actually getting to the targets that we're aiming for, then at that point there's the opportunity to review what the rules are, or review the plan, and change reductions as needed. I mean, basically it's about if we're achieving what the plan sets out to achieve, is there any need for further reductions?
So when you wrote that sentence, what did you have in your mind when you wrote the word objectives?
The targets, really.
For what?
If we're monitoring shallow groundwater and we're seeing a reduction in
Is it a
shallow
groundwater quality target or a nitrogen reduction target on farm?
groundwater quality target.
Groundwater quality target. So if we're achieving them, review the rules with regard to nitrogen loss reductions. So did you mean then ease off on them? Because if we're achieving the groundwater targets, we wouldn't need more nitrogen reductions, would we? Is that what you meant when you wrote that?
If you're achieving the groundwater quality targets...
Well, that's what you've just told me. You said objectives are the groundwater quality targets, and then you said when they're being achieved, review the rules with regard to the nitrogen loss reductions. So I'm just really trying to understand what you meant by this sentence.
So, if, for example, your nitrate concentrations are reducing and you're getting down to 1 milligram a litre, and you're confident that that's a result of your nitrate loss reductions, then at that point you need to review, and do you need to continue to impose land use change when you're actually getting to the point you want to get to?
So does that mean, in lay terms, don't require more nitrogen reductions than you need to get to your groundwater targets? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, effectively. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. No, nothing further. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon, will you allow me to ask a question which follows on before I come to you?
Certainly.
Will you forgive me?
I'll forgive you.
Thank you. Dr. Rutter, you've made it very clear to me from your evidence that you regard that the data that we have at the moment are incomplete and inadequate, and I understand that. So I'm asking you, are you able to give evidence as a groundwater hydrogeologist that there's no risk of nitrate in the groundwater of the Waimakariri zone reaching and contaminating the groundwater of the Christchurch West Melton aquifer?
With the data available, I don't think we can absolutely say that, no. So we can't be. There is a possibility that occurs. There's also a possibility it doesn't occur. So.
Yes. Thank you. So we have a position of uncertainty at the moment, and as it happens, the council has been given instructions in the national policy statement only last month about what to do when there's uncertainty. That it must not delay making decisions because of the uncertainty about the quality or quantity of information available. That's really the situation that the council's in at the moment, given the advice from you and all your colleagues that more monitoring and more collection of data is necessary. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, I think so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
No, my questions have been answered. Thank you.
Well, may we say thank you very much to Dr. Rutter for all that she's put into this and for coming today to give us the advice face to face. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Now, Ms. Wright. Do we have Ms. Sullivan going to present next?
Yes, we do. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Yes, we're moving on to the OTOP zone now, and Dr. Dole will present first on that, followed by Bianca Sullivan.
I see. All right. Welcome again, Dr. Dole.
No, thank you. Sorry, just trying to find the PowerPoint actually.
Okay. So,
It's gonna be one of these three here. Yeah, if I open those ones, they're all one act. Try in there. No. No. These were the three that were. Okay, maybe I'm sorry that we can't seem to find the PowerPoint, but I can basically talk through the main points anyway. Given that I've made a number of key points earlier as well.
you have, yes. You don't need to repeat them.
Yes. Yes. So, yes, really. So first of all, I'd just like to just make it known that I'm here as a substitute today. We had to put forward a minute because Jennifer Elizabeth Leslie can't make it today because of an impending birth. so I'm replacing her today. So having read her evidence, I'll just go through the key points, and I'm comfortable that I have a sufficient knowledge of what she has done to provide and speak to her evidence. So first of all, within her evidence, what has been stated is just really highlighting once again the significance of the dairy sector to economic growth in the Canterbury region, and also within the OTOPS district the OTOPS region more specifically. But one thing that we go into in more depth in the assessment is really highlighting the limitations or a lack of nuance around Mr. Harris's evaluation of the economic implications of the proposed policy in the OTOPS region. Firstly, one of the key points that we highlight is that he has focused on the average farm once again. And as I highlighted earlier when I spoke about the Waimakarere, what we saw was that really there's no such thing as an average farm, and there's a lot of subtlety or nuance around how individual farms are affected, especially when there's an overlay of a high GMP, high nitrogen limit required for GMP, an above average level of debt, and some low operating efficiency. So that was really the first point. The second point is to do with the fact that environment mitigations reduce the resilience of a dairy farm in the face of commodity price fluctuation. Agriculture is is a highly temporal game or a highly temporal business, so to speak. It's about how do we store things during the good times, and then when the hard times come, how do we hunker down? And usually there's a number of tools that we do to kind of manage that commodity price volatility. But when our monetary reserves are reduced, or we can't draw on our equity, especially when asset value is declining, it makes it much harder to draw on that reserve of equity. And so within the evidence, we speak about how profit during a low price year can be reduced by up to 30 or 40% when nitrogen reduction below GMP goes to 10 or 20%. So for an average farm, building on Mr. Harris's estimates, what we show is that if the milk price goes down, reduces to $5.60, which is an early forecast of the milk price this season, we see that profits fall by 34% for a 10% reduction in nitrogen, or a 39% reduction in profit, with a 20% reduction in nitrogen beyond GMP. So it's really about, when we farm, the focus is, people think that profit maximisation is what drives farming, but really it's financial resilience. It's how do you build capital? How do you build capital? So how do you build your asset base or build equity when milk price is highly volatile? And these within the evidence here, we really highlight the fact that mitigation can challenge that. And another point, the third point that we raised around Mr. Harris's evidence was the fact that he'd looked at the surface water restrictions and the nitrogen mitigation issues, the costs of that independently. However, there are some farms that will have to bear both, and so that that's a double whammy, so to speak, or that will only accentuate the costs or the kind of challenges facing that business. And the fourth, and as an expert, what I've noticed as well about the OTOP's economic assessment is something that I think is quite coarse, and I think I don't think it is valid. And I found in both the Waimakariri and the OTOP's district, I found the Mr. Harris raised a lot of good points. However, I found this part particularly disconcerting in that when he created the regional model to assess the regional implications of the nutrient losses and the surface water restrictions, he used data from the WIMAC to estimate the regional implications in the OTOPs. And so although they're both in Canterbury and of a similar size, they're actually totally different. They're actually totally different. They're diverse districts. Waimakariri is close to Christchurch. The population is about 30% higher than what's in OTOPs. And also the distribution of land and farming systems is quite diverse as well. And so what I found, although the use of the input-output table from the Waimakariri district is, even though that's convenient, it would actually lead to a biased outcome in my mind, because the flows of income between the different sectors is likely to be quite diverse in reality. There's another 2 points that I would like to raise in the summary of evidence. The first one is, once again, the impact of these restrictions on nitrogen and also surface water, the impacts of them on asset prices and also the debt position of farms. And I won't go into detail in that area, given that we've spoken about that extensively earlier. The second one also is the importance of a staged approach. Table 8. When we looked at the Waimakariri and we looked at Table 8.9, we see a transition, and within the OTOPS context as well, we also see a staged transition. And that transition is really important for businesses, given commodity price cycles and also the level of debt they're holding. However, a particular concern I had around the OTOPS proposed limits is that the first 10% nutrient reduction is scheduled to occur over a 10-year period, but then the second 10% occurs over a 5-year period. I believe that 5-year period is too short. I think we actually, given that the cost increases at an increasing rate as we mitigate more nitrogen, I believe that second stage actually introduces a lot of additional risk to the dairy farms, to dairy businesses within that region. And so I think that those are really the key points of my evidence. And once again, I'm sorry that we can't find this PowerPoint, but hopefully hopefully this summary's been useful.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you, Dr. Dool. We've valued that, and it's very convenient that we can hear this the same afternoon as we heard your fuller evidence about the WIMAC, and we understand the points that you've been making about the difference between the two districts, each of which need to be thought about separately.
Yes.
Now, we may have some further questions for you all the same. So I'll ask Commissioner Solomon if she has any questions of Dr. Dool with relation to the oath.
No, I don't have any questions for Mr. Dool.
Commissioner Van Dorthuizen?
No, me neither. The assumptions and sort of analysis of the lady who wrote the evidence, and she can't come, they're very similar to Dr. Dool's ones and his other evidence, so no questions of clarification. Thanks.
Just coming back, Dr. Dool, to the last point that you were making, which differentiates the two districts. And we're talking about the second period of reductions, where for the OTOP, it's a 5-year period rather than a 10-year period. And you were telling us your opinion that that is too short and creates a real risk.
Yes, that was my point.
And I'm wondering how that response should be related by the council and by those of us who have recommendations to make to the council in the light of the recent national policy statement, which seems to be adding more emphasis on getting on with the job and not delaying.
Yes. There's really 2 points I would make there. Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, what I would say is, the one thing which adds additional risk is that these requirements are required on top of what farmers have to do to get to GMP, which I think kind of accentuates my earlier point. But the second point is that I wonder if I'm actually getting, with relation to how it interacts with the national policy statement for freshwater management, I wonder if it's outside my expertise, and I'm not trying to avoid that, but I actually...
You're allowed to say that.
Yes. I'm actually, but... I don't have time to read Bianca's document.
Ms. Sullivan will tell us about it.
Yes.
Yes, no, it was open to you to remark on it if you wished and if you felt confident, and if you'd rather not, well, we don't have any thumbscrews. So I think that's all we should trouble you for, Dr. Dool, and many thanks for your forthcoming answers.
Thank you for your time.
Moving into the hot seat.
Thank you very much. Now we'll bring up the statement. So you've given us a statement in which you've not only given us your opinion, but you've done what is always helpful for us, and you've been quite specific about amendments that you're adopting or recommending, and we do thank you for that. Now, we have read your statement of evidence, of course, and if you would like to say something by way of summary of it now, well, we'd have a few minutes for that. The time is getting on, but we would like the opportunity before the end of the day to ask you one or two questions as well.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. I will try and keep this very brief then. I just wanted to highlight just a few key points that I'm making and that hopefully have come through quite strongly in my statement of evidence and also the hearing statement. I do support a lot of the changes that have been amended and the basis for the provisions in OTOP of Plan Change 7. There are, however, some key changes that I think that will strengthen the plan and with that I think probably enable and empower the community a lot more to be involved. Policies 4.4.18 and 19, which are the ones around nutrient reductions, the key changes that I've recommended are to only require the second stage of nitrogen reductions if that initial stage isn't met. And I think it's quite key to link the reductions to the water quality outcomes that's shown through monitoring. I've also recommended extending the second stage of nitrogen reductions from 1st of January 2035 to the 1st of January 2040, and I'll talk to that a little briefly in a moment. And also providing a little bit more flexibility for durations of consents as well, relying more on the region-wide policy rather than the specific policy proposed here. I think that by switching a focus to on-the-ground improvements rather than solely on overseer numbers will encourage engagement and involvement from the farming community. And that applies both to monitoring. I'm aware at the moment that Environment Canterbury don't have the resources to be doing the level of detail of monitoring across the region that's required really to track these limits and outcomes. And I know that there is sort of quite a lot of discussion within the community, within projects I've been involved in Canterbury, where the community are acknowledging that they need to actually get off the ground and start doing some monitoring. Now, I think if the water quality reductions required by the plan are linked to actual improvements in water quality, that's going to encourage engagement, and it's also going to focus them on what they can actually do to improve water quality. It's not just going to focus them on their overseeing numbers, which in my experience can be somewhat divorced from actual on-the-ground improvements. And I think through doing that, there would be better achievement of the national policy statement. And I think also the uncertainty around cumulative effects. And I've highlighted in my evidence that there's an issue where there's going to be significant impacts on the community from both the flow and level regimes and also from the nutrient reductions, but there was no cumulative effects assessment, both in terms of the environmental benefits that both will bring, but also on the economic costs, and Dr. Dawes touched on that. Now, I think with that uncertainty, it does sort of mean that there's a chance that we could be achieving these the water quality improvements and achieving those outcomes sooner than has been anticipated here. And I'd like to think that would be the case. But it does suggest maybe that that if we do link the second stage of the nitrogen reductions to water quality outcomes, there's going to be quite a lot of benefits with that. The other key point, and I suppose just in summary there, I think the amendments that I suggested be made to policy 4.4.19, I think they still hold. I didn't have any further suggestions to that. In terms of policy 4.4.20A, which is the policy that it addresses extensions to reductions, I think this is quite a key policy. And I think the way that it's drafted, I think it's going to be quite impractical to actually implement. At the moment, it's only considering improvements from the 09 to 13 baseline period. And so a farmer's going to have made improvements back in the 09 to 13 baseline period and be able to demonstrate that they were effective, so that they would have had to have gone, I suppose, made significant improvements then. Farmers often don't have records for that period. They struggle to find those records. They would not have, in hindsight, be able to look back and sort of say exactly what improvements were demonstrated. They wouldn't be able to demonstrate that. So I think that's it's going to be very difficult for anybody to get over that hurdle, I think, through that policy. I was suggesting that any improvements be linked to the baseline GMP loss rate, so that they need to be demonstrating that they've made improvements beyond that GMP loss rate number, or they are tracking in advance of what the plan reductions would be anticipating. And also, I think another consideration that it would be useful to include is consideration of the impact of the flow and level regime changes. If somebody's had significant impacts from that flow and level regime, which would be resulting in more water being left in the river, which is going to be having some positive effects on the environment, I think it's probably reasonable to cut them a little bit of slack in terms of the reductions. If they are making an effort to make a lot of nitrogen loss reductions, they're also suffering from higher minimum flows. It may be that they need a little bit more time to implement those. So I suggested some amendments there as well. So just moving briefly on to Table 14ZC, which is the nitrogen loss reductions table. The amendments that I've suggested there are pushing the reductions out from 2035 to 2040. The first stage of reductions at 2030, I think is appropriate. From the evidence of Dr. Dool, as well as the uncertainty around the sort of lack of cumulative assessment and the fact that we may actually be achieving these reductions sooner, but with considerably more economic cost. Pushing it out to 2040 is going to give people more time to implement the more significant changes that would be required. I've also suggested linking to the water quality outcomes to incentivise farmers, as I discussed before. And I've considered the amendments that I've suggested against the NPSFM, and it sounds like there might be some questions around that. But in my experience, I do think that the amendments I've suggested would sort of strengthen it and strengthen the provisions and certainly lead towards potentially achieving the outcomes sooner. That's the summary.
Well, thank you for that. It does demonstrate that however much we get in writing in advance, it's the actual presence of a witness being here in person and explaining in the way that you have done, Ms. Sullivan, is an added value as far as the evidence is concerned. I'll see if there's some questions from my colleagues. Commissioner Solomon, any questions for Ms. Sullivan?
Yes, just a couple, just clarification really. And I was heartened to hear your comments about farmers being able to... I don't think farmers are doing a justice to themselves because they don't record improvements they've made. I mean, apart from farm environment plans, the general public don't get to see that. So I think that would be really helpful and give the wider community confidence if we had access to show what improvements farmers are doing, and also linking that with monitoring, self-monitoring. I thought your comment around farmers getting out and doing some monitoring was a really good idea. But anyway, so I'm going to go back to, and I've only got a couple, and I just...
If I could just comment on the monitoring too, and I know you'll hear more about this from Waimakariri Irrigation, but I'm aware in a number of areas in Canterbury there are, the communities are trying to get together and work with ECAN to try and fill gaps and get monitoring programs that are quite complementary, linking in with zone committees and others. So that there is quite a lot of motivation within the community to work together and try and get something that's integrated monitoring programs that are complementary to what ECAN's doing and will help inform future plan changes.
That's great. It's actually heartening to hear that. I want to go back to your evidence now, and it's just a couple of points of clarification I need. If you go to your paragraph 16, where and you say when creating the lake as a result of building the dam, it actually changed the natural water body forever. So are you now saying Lake Pupuha should not strive to be pristine because it's man-made for use as an irrigation reservoir? Have I understood that correctly?
I think I'm saying that it's unrealistic to expect it to be pristine. And partly that's because it was I suppose it was a lake that was farmland prior to being a lake. I'm not saying that it's. I mean, I think it would be fantastic to aspire to it being pristine, but whether it's realistic, given that it is artificial, and its levels are managed artificially, I'm not sure that it's a realistic expectation for an artificial lake.
But wouldn't you have an attribute that strived for that?
I think you could. Whether it's going to be something that would be achievable given the limitations and the way the lake levels are managed, it is artificial. I mean, it's probably a little bit beyond my expertise to comment on whether it could get to a pristine level.
Okay. And at paragraph 25, are you saying that because we won't be able to see any environmental benefits by reducing nitrate discharges and increasing minimum flows between the years 2030 and 2035, we need to extend the time to 2035 to 2040? You may be right, we might not see any benefits or even discernible benefits, but how do you know there'll actually be no benefits?
I mean, I think we can assume that if the nitrogen loss reductions are occurring, then there will be benefits at some point. Yeah. And I suppose I'm saying there that 5 years between 2030 and 2035 it's not very long considering the economic impact, and that we won't actually know whether those 2030 reductions may have actually it may get us where we need to go. We don't know that. By pushing it out to 2040, they'll still be making those reductions will still be occurring, but the economic impact is going to be more manageable, and with any luck the community will be seeing the positive impacts of the actions that they've done, which will hopefully be spurring them along a little bit more, rather than it just be one thing on top of another, which will be very difficult to manage given the economic impacts.
That's all from me, thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, thank you. Just before I ask the question, I just need to clarify something. So for table 14ZC, the nitrogen concentration area stage reductions, are you saying that the 2035 reductions should be made 2040, but they should occur as of right, so they shouldn't be linked to monitoring, they should just be required to occur, which is different to what Ms Wright said for the Waimakariri similar table. So I just want to clarify what you're saying to us.
I'm suggesting that the 2030 reductions happen as of right, yes. And that the 2035 is pushed out to 2040, but is linked to the water quality outcomes.
Right, so that's the same proposition that Ms Wright was putting to us for Waimakariri. Yes. So I put this question to both of you because I didn't get a chance to ask Ms Wright about this, but I've got two problems with that proposition, and they both relate to lags. The first one is what I will call an implementation lag, because both table 14ZC and 8.9, the first column says by January 2030, and farmers being human beings are likely to leave things till the end of that decade rather than the start of the decade, and so we might not get any meaningful change until close to 2030. And the second lag is the actual lag in terms of changes to land use activities showing up in groundwater and connected surface water, there's a lag time anywhere from years to decades. So if we were to base moving from the 2030, only imposing the 2040 reductions in either part of the region, because of the lag issues, human and groundwater, we simply might not know whether those 2040 things should be imposed based on monitoring, because it'll be an insufficient database to draw any conclusions from because of those two lags. So that's why I'm struggling with the proposition that we should hold off on the 2040 ones and only put them in if monitoring shows that to be the case, because I don't see that providing the certainty of outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think they're good points that we've certainly discussed and considered, which is one of the reasons why there's a footnote for Table 14 ZC anyway, which is saying that those 2040 reductions shall only be required if the limits and targets aren't met or on the pathway to be met by the 1st of January 2030. And the idea around that is to encourage people to put measures in place sooner rather than later, and incentivise them to I suppose, to go hard and go fast to get their nitrogen loss under control, and make those reductions so that we can actually start seeing those improvements by 2030 and seeing that trend changing. I acknowledge that the actual lag and those changes showing up, it may take time, and that's certainly going to vary depending on where you are, is my understanding. And that's something that will largely be out of control. But I think it will, reality will be that perhaps we get to 2030 and there's not the changes, the improvements showing up that's been anticipated, which will then mean that people then have to make those, get their plans in place of how they're going to make those reductions by the next stage.
So you acknowledge the problem.
Yeah.
I haven't really heard a solution to it, other than in an ideal world, people you hope will do on-farm changes sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And then hopefully that might show up in the groundwater if we're lucky.
And if it doesn't, then those reductions will still have to occur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it much simpler then just to say that they must occur?
Yes, but I don't know that you'll get the same buy-in and get the same reductions happening. I think you'll have them occurring over a shorter time period if the incentive is there for the community to actually get out and make those changes.
And then the other issue I had is that Table 8-9, the 2040 reductions, they're a maximum of 30% for dairy. And Table 14ZC, it's 20% for dairy is the 2035 one. So that, looking at the first, well, Table 14Z only has 2 periods, but in Table 8-9, the first 2 periods max out at 30%. And if I look at Ms Wright's evidence, at her paragraph 5.10, she states that in the Selwyn and Hines area, farmers are on track to meet 30% reductions in end loss by 2022. So it indicates to me that 30% reductions are achievable in real life, on real farms, and that they can happen in quite a short order of time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my understanding though that there is a difference between the zones, and that in the Waimakariri area, farmers will have to get to baseline GMP first. So so the amount of reduction needed to get to baseline GMP needs to be added to what is then expected under Plan Change 7, which is different to what is the case in Selwyn.
Okay. So maybe can we just have, in reply, the staff just clarify for us, given the evidence we have that we're meeting 30% reductions in Selwyn and Hines by 2022, just what the starting point for that was? I can't recall. I should, but I can't.
It's baseline, I think, isn't it?
And then we'll be able to see if we're comparing apples with apples or not. All right, thank you. That's all.
I wonder if I might come back to Ms Sullivan's evidence in paragraph 47. this is where you've been constructive and you've presented some revised wording. And of course, you did that before we had the NPS FM 2020. And if I look at the revised wording, and I'm looking at subsection C, which refers to the benefit in terms of maintaining a farming activity's financial viability. That was entirely understandable at the time that you wrote, but I'm not clear that that's something that you would be able to hold to in the light of the NPS FM 2020. How would you like to respond to that?
I think that is a good point. I mean, the hierarchy within within the NPS FM is pretty clear that's bottom of the heap.
It's pretty rigid, isn't it?
Yeah. I do wonder though, if you are going to be considering an application, I mean, maybe it's just a matter of changing the wording more to make sure that the actual reductions are the top priority, and that I think it'd still be reasonable to consider the costs, because if the costs are significant, whereas if the costs aren't very much, I think that's something that if you were making a decision in that regard, you would want to think about that. But I think the progress towards it, the progress made towards achieving the nitrogen limits and D there in my paragraph 47 would certainly be the key.
Yes. Well, thank you. I think that we don't need to go further into that unless there's something further you want to add. But it seems to me that we've got to get used to the idea of thinking about these things by reference to that quite rigid hierarchy.
Yeah, it is very clear.
Which is a plain obligation. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you.
And Ms. Wright, I think we've reached about the end of the day. Is there anything further that Dairy New Zealand would like to add, or can we conclude this at this point?
No, that concludes our presentation for the day. Thank you very much for your time and consideration in this.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for having come and put all of the effort in and presented such a clear and understandable set of proposals. Thank you indeed. So the hearing is now adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.